Hi, welcome to Microeconomics, Econ 221. This particular session will involve mapping out our Chapter 3 learning. To begin with, I'm going to be divvying up Chapter 3 into 6 individual video clips. And in the first video clip, what we're going to do is share an introduction to the content in Chapter 3. So let me proceed to that. So this particular PowerPoint slide set will be installed in your Canvas for the course. First of all, the chapter title is Markets. So we're going to learn about what a market is. Market is a mechanism, and it's a mechanism to trade private goods. Oftentimes, a lot of people make mistakes in saying that the free market is the best solution to all kinds of economic transactions, and that's only partially true. Markets are a concept that was developed to study and understand a mechanism, an economic mechanism that is specifically designed to trade private goods and that is specifically efficient and optimal at trading private goods under certain conditions that we will call assumptions. So we're going to build a market model that is called the competitive market model and study it in chapters 3, 4, and 5. A market, as it says on this very detailed slide, it's a mechanism that enables mutually advantageous voluntary exchanges of something for something else, of what we would call a quid pro quo, something for something in Latin. For exchanges to be mutually advantageous and mutually voluntarily, the two parties have to gain something from agreeing to exchange in this voluntary way. And what that means is that from each vantage point in the transaction, the opportunity costs of the trade make a lot of sense. In other words, what they're getting in value must exceed or be no less than what they are giving up in value for this to occur. And the name of this sort of exchange is called a Pareto exchange, after a Swiss Italian called Wilfred Pareto, who came up with the idea that exchange and trade had to be of equal or greater, for something of equal or greater value in order for it to occur voluntarily. But there are two subtleties in these exchanges. Not only will you have to agree that what you are getting is probably more valuable than what you're giving up in the exchange for the exchange to occur voluntarily, but it must be the case that you must be able to keep that value private, which means that you must be able to exclude other parties from receiving benefits conferred by the exchange in order for that to be of value to you at the exclusion of others. It must be for private goods. The problem is that if you cannot exclude others from getting value from the transaction, then others are getting something for nothing, in which case there might be, under certain cultural prerogatives, jealousy, envy, all kinds of different personal feelings that might get in the way of transacting. Because why should you pay for someone else's benefit, especially if that someone else is a stranger or somebody you might not even like? And so the assumption of exclusion, of there being an exclusionary nature to the transaction, is really important. And that's one dimension of what we call a private good. The second part that's kind of subtle is that there's going to be rivalry in the process of the transaction, because once you have access to that good. It's yours, and there should be a whole body of rights, of property rights, that confer the ownership of what you buy to only you, to the buyer, and to the recipient of the benefit from buying, the seller, should also be the owner of what they sell. And so it's only in private goods that we see a clarity of these types of property rights that are so obvious that people can use these voluntary exchange mechanisms called markets to trade. The particular slide that you're seeing now exhibits these two dimensions of goods. One is rivalry on the rows, and the other issue of excludability in the columns. A private good must be fully excludable and fully rivalrous in consumption. Like, for example, a food item. If I buy a candy bar and I start chewing and eating it, nobody else can chew it or eat it because I'm already chewing and eating it, and it would be gross to get a secondhand chewable chewed piece of candy or something. Not so with clothes necessarily, because I could be, we've all probably experienced t-shirts getting stolen somewhere. We've all had cars that we buy used, not new. And so some consumer goods are kind of quasi-private. So this notion of perfect excludability and perfect rivalryness or rivalrousness only occurs in certain goods. And in those cases, markets are more perfect vessels of exchange. To the extent that a good is not fully excludable or not fully rivalrous, there's a continuum in this blue space that you see surrounded by the perimeter of 4 orange stars. There's a continuum where private goods sort of move into the realm of what we call natural resources or common goods, goods in common. Like, for example, fish in a lake, or timber in a forest, or coal or other minerals in soil, where we run into the problem of non-excludability. An example of this would be as migrants in the United States were making their way west, as the United States kept expanding the number of states from the 13 original states to the 50 that we currently have in our United States, in our union of countries, in our union of states. As people expanded, they were expanding into territory that was not part of the United States. And so the question became, well, what is this? Who owns this, and who has rights to do this or that? In that situation, markets don't always work very well at creating or establishing the conditions for trade. That's why I put the words constitutions here, because what you may have to create is a whole new republic, like the Republic of California or the Republic of Nevada, or the Commonwealth of how the Commonwealth of Virginia was created. So sometimes these constitutions create republics, other times they create commonwealths. Hence, notice the word common in Commonwealth, where you're creating a zone, a geographic zone with borders, in order to create another republic or another nation state that becomes part of the United States of America, for example. So constitutions are a mechanism that sometimes replace markets in the dealing with how to transact in goods that don't have excludability. As we move from the right, top right, to the bottom right, what we lose is the realm of rivalryness. When a good is not subject to rivalryness, for example, you're breathing air next to someone else and the air is fresh for them and it's fresh for you, the freshness of the air to you may not be an issue that impacts the freshness of the air to someone else. Or when we build a new type of hyper fast or hypersonic missile that provides for a common defense under the US Constitution, we create a public good that protects the United States of America and everybody in it in the same way without causing rivalry. By that we mean that the threat that such a missile creates for adversaries or enemies in a military sense create a national defense for us all in the same way. So a national defense would be an example of a federal public good. A local public good is like a public education system. A public education system is like where we are. We are in the Contra Costa County Community College system or in the San Ramon Valley High School district. And these districts, community college districts or high school districts, are local governments. And these local governments provide access to educational services and to educational commodities in a local sense. We are in effect local governments that just like the city of Walnut Creek is a local government, just like the East Bay Municipal Utility District is a local government. So sometimes these local governments provide public goods, and we find a way to pay for these public goods. In the case of education, we pay through a common tax on property called property taxes. And the people who pay property taxes are property owners in the case of residential homes that are where people live in homes they have quote unquote purchased. Or it could be a renter, because a renter pays rent. And part of that rent is charged by the landlord so that the landlord can cover all their costs and then some. So there's a market for a rental unit where you're renting the use of space, and those are some of the rights that you're buying in the market. And part of that money, in effect, goes to pay for a public good called local education. And then as we slide from public goods on the bottom right to club goods on the bottom left, a club good is like a movie theater or like a country club where people or only certain people are allowed to participate or play. A club good is a private school. Another kind of club good is a charter school. The difference between a private school and a charter school is that a private school is more like a private good because you can only attend there if you're admitted and if you go and partake of the educational benefits of being in a private school. However, your attaining education doesn't prevent others from getting education. So there's no rivalry there. You know, many people can watch the same educational video and partake of its benefits. And so there's almost no difference between a private school and a charter school, with the exception, of course, that charter schools are not just paid by direct payments from, say, guardians or parents of the students in those schools, but also by taxpayers in some mechanism that gets decided by some local ordinance or some local government. Finally, club goods are really don't involve governments and don't directly as the managers of the goods provision. In club goods, you usually have private sector entities that are non-governmental managing the use of the goods in a non-rivalrous way. And in that case, what we usually have in order to apprise the proper mechanism for transacting on club goods, we usually use contracts. So that's what the meaning of those words are on the periphery of the slide. The only instance where markets are usually solutions to the way we exchange commodities is in the case of private goods. So we're in this class talking practically almost all the time about private goods. And even in the case of private goods, sometimes private goods aren't perfectly excludable. Sometimes they're not perfectly rivalrous, and sometimes they generate or confer benefits or costs to others. When they confer costs, we call private goods with externalities. And private goods with externalities result in what many used to call market failure, but it just so happens that markets work perfectly when private goods are perfectly private, and markets don't work perfectly when private goods are not perfectly private. Just like contracts don't always work, that's why people go to court to fight over contracts. Constitutions don't work, that's why sometimes countries fall apart and other countries have to rebuild or restructure. And sometimes government also fails to work properly. Like we see, for example, with forest management practices in temperate zones, like in Chile or California or Australia right now, particularly Australia and California in this summer weather, and particularly when it's winter for us, it's summer in Chile, for example, and we see a lot of fires in countries that are very arid and have forest, and their forests are not managed properly. We tend to have climate impacting in a very adverse way, and we lose much forestry, and we end up with the kind of air quality we've seen in the last few days. So it's not only that markets fails, but markets do fail, contracts fail, constitutions fail, local government, state government, federal governments may also fail sometimes. And it's not really that they fail, it's that they are institutions and mechanisms that humans create, and we humans are imperfect. And so everything we do in the creation of our mechanisms to solve our social and individual decision-making and problems, those solutions are as perfect as we are. So I hope this particular conversation clarifies where our course will take place in this commodity space. It'll take place on markets, and it will refer to private goods. The next figure here that you see is essentially what a market looks like. And a market is composed of S for supply and D for demand. So we're going to be focusing our attention in chapter 3 on the green box in the middle, where goods are flowing from sellers to buyers, and money, quote unquote, is flowing from buyers to sellers in payment for this particular money is the quid for the quo of the goods, the quid pro quo. So the green arrows are showing the quid pro quo inside the market between consumers and producers, between supply and demand. And some of the next 5 videos that you see on chapter 3 will be on the supply and demand dynamics. What do suppliers do with the money flowing to them? Well, what they do is they pay themselves the benefit conferred by their know-how and their effort and their sacrifice of their time that they are foregoing for making these private goods. But they also pay for the procurement of inputs into the production of the output. And so the money flows go from the transaction through the suppliers into the production function, where you pay for the inputs you used in the production process. And among those inputs that you procured were labor and capital. And labor and capital come from resources that you procure from people who are consumers also. And so you use the money to pay for the resource procurement that comes from consumers. And in fact, that money is what consumers then use as resource to dispose of the resource in order to go into the market and buy things they want to buy. And these resources are in effect rooted in the use of resources by firms such as labor and financial capital in order to build the necessary infrastructure of supply. So we're not going to deal with this system. I'm just showing you the entire system of exchange so that you can see that there's nothing really exogenous to the system because everything is self-contained. What kind of resources really drive the engine of markets is born out of individuals who have resources to procure and to leverage into firms so that these firms can make things that ultimately every individual wants to buy. And so the orange flow of procuring resources and the green arrows of quid pro quo are all falling into this endogenous system of exchange that we call the market system. But the focus in chapter 3 will be on the interior black box that has only dealing with supply and demand. So there are 7 things that we're going to focus on in chapter 3. The first is what are competitive markets, because that's when we talk about the market, we're going to be talking about a perfectly competitive market. And after that, we're going to watch videos on what is demand, how does demand change, how does quantity demanded change, because that's a different kind of change than just demand. Demand refers to all of the conditions surrounding the procurement of goods in a market, the quo part of the market, whereas quantity demand is the amount of goods that actually are buying. So it's a quantitative question rather than a question about the intrinsic nature of demand and consumption. Then we're going to talk about about supply and similar aspects to supply, what creates changes in supply versus changes in quantity supplied. And then we're going to get supply and demand to meet in this mechanism called the market, and we're going to create a story of equilibrium, a story of compromise between supply and demand that enables us to quantify value, price, and volume, quantity, that these markets attain, and also how these markets results, how these market equilibria can change because of conditions changing for the consumers or for the suppliers in the market. So all in all, we're going to talk about markets as collections of buyers and sellers who voluntarily trade in private goods or services within a competitive market called the perfectly competitive market. And the perfectly competitive market consists of many perfectly informed buyers and sellers who transact on a private good that is uniform and that has no perceptive or perceptual differences in quality or in nature from one another. So we call this a uniform or homogeneous commodity. And then there are, in this kind of market, no extraneous influences that impact differentially anyone buyer or anyone seller. And so there's no power on the part of suppliers to influence the price upward or for consumers to influence the price downward. In the raw, the ultimate price and quantity is something that occurs by what seems like an invisible hand, in the words of Adam Smith, where supply and demand sort of by compromise arrive at these equilibrium situations. And they do so with the assumption that there are differentials in what we call costs of exchange or transaction costs. So those 5 conditions that you see in the slide right now are the 5 conditions of a perfectly competitive market. And over the next few videos, we will be talking and conversing about demand, the nature of demand, and how demand changes, supply, the nature of supply, how supply changes, and then connecting both into equilibrium and how equilibrium might be impacted or changed by intrinsic factors in demand and supply. I hope that this session, that this particular video has been useful, as I hope that the next few videos are useful also in your completion of your homework, your quizzes, and your discussions. Thanks for watching.